afternoon and welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex and today we'll be discussing TWiST administration and troubleshooting. If you're new to our GoToWebinar series, we finally got new slides for this with the correct screenshot for the current version of GoToMeeting, but there's a zoom button in the title bar that can be used to adjust scaling. So if my screen appears too large or too small for you, you can use that to adjust the size that it shows up. There is also a Q&A area in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you have any questions about what I'm showing, just type your questions in there. If anything relevant to what I'm discussing comes up, I may pause to address it. Otherwise, we typically go over those questions at the end. As mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do one of these the third Wednesday of each month usually. We've been pushing them back a bit recently. I've been a bit swamped with tickets, but generally one a month or every other month at this point. Details are posted when we know what we're going to be doing at blanchardsystems.com/events, or more recently been trying to push them onto our Zendesk as well, so keep an eye out there as well. As far as today, we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, TWiST administration and troubleshooting. And this is one of those topics we've got. Looking at the attendee list here, we've got a pretty good mix of people. Some people who are newer to system administration. We've got a few veterans here who've been doing this for a long time. So very mixed crowd today. So my goal is going to be, this started out, we were trying to think of what to do for the webinar, and we had a bunch of tickets come in on just different people having trouble with their TWiST server. And the initial thought we were spitballing around was doing a webinar on just all the different things you can look for to help troubleshooting when something doesn't happen, like a workflow stops or a host won't start. So we started running with that goal in mind. And while I was putting together the kind of setup for that, I thought it would be good to put some more overview of how TWiST works in there, especially if you haven't seen some of the under the hood parts of it and might not understand how all the parts connect together. My goal is to demystify TWiST from that administrative standpoint and show how you can troubleshoot just overall server-based problems with your system. We're not going to be doing too much with workflow troubleshooting, like settings, for example, where you drop in a PDF and type gets messed up, or you have weird color conversion issues. This is going to be strictly focused, just for time reasons, on the administration side, keeping the server part of TWiST running. So we're going to go over all the different parts that make up TWiST, how those hosts are configured and how all those parts fit together, and then how to troubleshoot those common issues. So Jude is also on. He knows more about this than I ever will. So he is probably going to jump in whenever I make any horrible mistakes in here. So with that said, we'll get started. So one of the things that comes up a lot with TWiST is TWiST wasn't really developed as its own product initially. Back was, I think, maybe in the late 80s, Dalim started by developing a product called Litho. And Litho is a graphic editing tool which is used for editing different types of graphics. So it can do raster images, sort of like what you do with Photoshop, where you're adjusting color or whatever for just like bitmap images. It can also do, you can also use it to modify vector graphics. And on top of that, more kind of into the InDesign realm, page compositing. Litho is still out there. We do still have a few customers who use it and love it. It's a bit of an older app. It doesn't see quite as much popularity these days. But as part of the application, Dalim started building command line access points for some of the things that Litho could do, so that you didn't have to call up the user interface to manipulate things. You could also call some of those tools directly on the command line. And from there, I think it sort of spitballed into, they built an entire automation engine on top of Litho called TWiST, so that you didn't have to do some of these tasks manually. You could build a workflow engine on top of it. So every TWiST install secretly runs Litho underneath, and it uses that Litho tool set. And that comes up a bit because this is an application that's been around. TWiST has been around for 30 years, I think, almost 30 years at this point. Litho's been around for a little longer than that. And when you're looking through, I know this tends to be one of the parts that gets confusing if you're new to administering one of these systems. Looking through some of these directories is a little looking through an old photo album from high school. You can see the different years, you can see the different fashions changing. So a lot of the different parts of the application were developed at different times for different purposes, and they used different technologies as part of that. So some of those are sort of frozen in amber if you look at your TWiST server. So the current versions of TWiST stand today, the user interface is written in Java. So the editor application, all the tool settings you're working with are written in Java. the workflow server, which actually handles running files through the workflow and passing them from step to step, uses Tcl. The actual low-level graphic manipulation uses C++, and that's those original litho tools. And then the APIs in the web front end, so like WebLink and some of the connectivity to ES for ES Connect is done in Java, server-based Java implementation with Tomcat. So, and it's actually funny with how those are tied together, because if you actually look at, if you have a TWiST server right now, you have a litho on it, and you can open it up and you can do whatever you want to with files in it. So I can edit the text and say whatever I want. But it's funny because if you go to, for example, save this file, then you're getting the options in here. You're seeing the OPDF output settings from TWiST. If of course, it's going to be dramatically slow now that I tried to show this, but yep. So you'll see you get the exact OPDF output settings you know from TWiST. So it's really are the same application, just TWiST is litho with that extra workflow engine on top of it. So as far as what runs the application, what are the core services behind TWiST? There's four main core services that come into play here. The repository, the gate, the workflow server, and Tomcat. The repository is, and if all these technical details here are a little too much, I have some graphics I'll be showing on the next slides, but the repository is sort of the, I guess the instruction book, you could say, of TWiST that stores all the workflows that you have. It stores the master copies of those workflows, the tool settings, the cluster settings. It knows which TWiST servers are hooked together with each other if you've got multiple TWiST servers running together in a cluster. There is the gate, and the repository is normally, if you see it in some of the services, it's usually referred to as R server for short. There's the gate, which is usually referred to as, I think, TWiST gate. That runs on ports 6042 and 8081. That allows users to log into TWiST. So when you log into editor and you're connecting to editor, that's going, everything there is going through the gate. There's the workflow server, which, as I mentioned, is that's sort of the brain of TWiST. That's when you're running files through a workflow. That's what manages the files in the workflow and pushes them from step to step and shepherds them through that process. And then the last component is Tomcat, which is not used very much directly for TWiST, but it is used for connecting TWiST to some other applications and other uses. So WebLink, for example, runs in Tomcat. If you're using TWiST with ES Connect, or using TWiST with ES via ES Connect, that component runs at least partially in Tomcat. For most of these scripts, there are server scripts in Symlink's common services. So actually, if I pull up my server here, I can show you. I can figure out how to resize a window. So LCD in there. And so, for example, you have server scripts for example, and you can do three main commands for those. You can do status, you could do stop if you wanted to stop the service, you could do start if you wanted to start it. I think there actually might be a restart command too that I forgot to put on here. The one that isn't listed in here is, and I don't have a great answer for you today on this, is the workflow server. From memory, I think there is a systemd service that handles that. But generally the best way to restart that if that goes down is to do a host restart in editor. And we'll get into some of the troubleshooting later on, but that's typically how we wind up restarting it. If there are more problems with that, there is a systemd script I think you can use to restart it, but generally that's more trouble than it's worth. At that point, there are other interventions that are more productive. So just to give you, that's the overview of those. If you want to understand how they work in context, so here I've got my TWiST server. I've got my repository, so that contains, for example, all your workflows. If you've got your TWiST workflow that makes X1A PDFs, that's going in the repository. Also any parameters, so if you've got custom settings for OPDF, or you've got trap rules or trap ink sets, those all get stored in the repository. You've got the workflow server, which is the running workflows you see and deal with in editor. And there's the gate, which is used to connect to TWiST from the client. So if you run up editor on your Mac, then it's going to use port 6042, and the documentation says it also uses 8081. I'm not sure what it does at that port. I was looking around at this earlier and I couldn't see any traffic on that port when I tried logging in, but it uses those ports to connect up. This has come up recently in some of the AWS installs where people are firewalling these systems very heavily and they're having trouble getting editor to connect. So these are ports to watch out for if you're moving TWiST into the cloud and you're having issues getting editor to connect up to your TWiST server. So that's how that works. And then once you connect up to the gate talks to the other internal components. So if you are trying to see what workflows are going on, the gate will talk to those. I think it also pulls down, it might also pull from the repository too, because when you sync up to editor, when you connect to editor, it downloads a local copy of this repository to your own personal computer, which hopefully I'm not going on too much of a tangent here. But it's in a little different path if you're on a Mac. I'm on a PC here, but it's when you, actually let me delete a file in here and I'll show you. So if I delete a few of these workflows, when I go to my editor instance, usually when you first log in, it does like a sync check to see what's new on the server. The way that TWiST works is this repository is always sort of like a master record. Nothing works with this directly. So when the workflow server starts up, it makes its own backup copy of this repository and it works with like a rough working copy. It doesn't actually do anything with the kind of master one here. It keeps that clean for its own posterity, I guess. And when you connect up and the gate does that check, it downloads this repository to a folder on your local computer. So on the PC, that's under your account, app data, local, Dalim, and then the name of the TWiST server and the port. You can see these two are regular TWiST servers. This one, because this lists 8080 as the repository port, that's an eTWiST server, which we're not going to be focused on too much today. But it makes local copies of everything in that repository on my machine. So when I'm editing workflows here in Editor, if I'm making changes to this workflow, I'm editing the local copy that exists on my PC. When I hit save and push it up, then that will get past the gate and the gate will pass that into the repository. So a bit of an older architecture there, but that's how that winds up working. It does have a nice side benefit of being a backup if anything goes wrong, as we'll look into a little later. But that's how that works on simple connections. Now, if you're going to upload a file to TWiST, typically you're dealing with TWiST, you're using hot folders if you're uploading directly to TWiST. So if you have your PDF here and your PC and you push that in, typically you're connecting up to hot folder somewhere on that machine, and typically you're going through some sort of a file share unless you're working directly on the TWiST server, which most people don't. So whether that's Samba or FTP or NFS, you've got some sort of file share there at the OS level, and that file share points to a TWiST hot folder. And the workflow server is watching that hot folder, and any files that come in for your particular workflow, it picks up and runs those. Those hot folders exist. If I pull up my VM here real quick, I'll get rid of my litho instance here too. So I'll pull up my folders here. So that's under Symlinks. The standard hot folder path is Symlinks IO jobs workflow. And I'm just gonna quit my mail client so I don't get any more surprise messages here. But any workflows you create by default, if you make a new workflow, it gets a hot folder in the Symlinks IO jobs workflow path. And it's under the name of your TWiST host. So my host is CentES6. Those hot folders are local to the specific TWiST server you're working on. So if you have two different TWiST servers in a cluster, they'll each have their own local hot folder. And you can control which workflows, which servers that machine's deployed on an editor, but each of those will have their own hot folder. You can also specify custom hot folder paths in editor, of course, and those can be either local to the machine or they can be in another path, which has some snags we'll look into later. But the workflow server will watch that hot folder whenever files get pushed in there. It'll take them and it'll run with them. And one of the interesting things about that is that I think, do I actually have any files running in my editor right now? I can't remember if I deleted them. Yeah, it's whenever you push a files into the workflow in one of those folders, the actual working file, since all the workflow server portion runs in Tickle, all the state information is hidden under that hot folder for whatever's going through. So my workflow here, I have two files that were in that X1A tester workflow here. So if I open up that hot folder, there is a hidden folder in there called .inprocess. And if you open that up, you'll see different folders in there for each of the individual processes that's running through your workflows. I just stuck a validate at the end of my workflow so these files would hang in TWiST so you could see it. When the workflow finishes, that folder does get removed. But you can see I got my two processes, 2308 and 2309. And if I open those up, then I can see I have my actual file in here, so the PDF I'm working with. If I push this through the PS check, it's an OPDF now, but if I still had that before it hit the PS check, I would see, like, for example, all the or after it hit the PS check but before the OPDF, then I would see all the intermediate files that PS check made there. You can also see there's setup files, so these are all sorts of tool params or like workflow state for the TWiST table, all gets stored in Tickle text files in there. And there's also a resources folder in here, which this looks like this is some extracted XML. That's some just XMP metadata that I think PS check found in my PDF and extracted. And if I go out of there and go to my other one, that has the same deal. I think that one was a JPEG. Actually, no, that one, it was a JPEG I turned into a PDF. But that's how those work. Is that process? All the working files are in there. So if you even want to call a third-party tool in the middle of a TWiST workflow, you can point it to that path. There's a special variable in TWiST I can get you if you're interested in. But you basically point to the actual live file that TWiST is running through, and it's all maintained with those Tickle variable files and the working files in those hidden folders. So that's how that winds up working there on the back end. Now, what if you have two clusters? Typically how this winds up working is you have one overall master repository for the entire cluster. So if you have two TWiST servers hooked together, this one, for example, TWiST1, this is the master, and this other server is going to make a replica or a copy of that master repository, and it's going to use that to run. It's going to use that to run the workflows locally if it needs to run them. However, that's going to be if you make any changes to the workflow, they're going to get saved back to the master repository. That's the kind of home base here. Different servers can, of course, be configured to have different workflows running on them. So I have a second workflow that's running on my first server that's not running on my second. You can also have differences with components. So, for example, I only have the gate enabled on this one server, this TWiST server 1. On this particular instance, I could only log into editor if I put in the IP address or host name for TWiST server 1. TWiST 2 wouldn't let me in. You can have the gate running on both of them, but that's a choice thing. I was talking to Jude earlier about this because we've changed recommendations a few times over the years. I think there was one point during the TWiST 8 era he was saying where that was recommended due to some quirks we had at that point. The general recommendation he has now is for TWiST 9 is to only run the gate on one server and use that for your kind of main point of reference for logging in. So, but those two repositories, the second repository will always stay in sync with the master, and they'll both have their own copies. The workflow servers will run from the local copy of the repository on each machine, and they'll each have their own hot folders set up. So one thing as part of this too is, in addition to these services, there's just different key paths. We're trying to put together a list of paths if you're trying to do system admin work. It would be useful to have handy. And these are a few of the ones I think are interesting to just note. So the first one is the Symlinx Common Services. That's where your service scripts live when you need to start or restart various parts of TWiST. There's the Symlinx IO Jobs Workflow server name. That's your default hot folder location. It's also got that hidden in process folder that we use to manage the running workflows. And this is when I talked earlier about how this was different parts of TWiST were built at different times. I think that's where also you come into some of these different paths, because there are some things that originally were built for litho, there are some things that were originally built for TWiST, and some of these have version numbers in them, because I guess they used to update some of these paths. So they would say something's for TWiST 5, and after 6, I guess they just got tired of updating that path every version and breaking everyone's scripts. So they just decided to keep it as is. If you're ever wondering why there's just different paths or different version numbers in there, there's not always a method to it. Some of it's just what was done at the time that that particular folder was implemented, which can make it a little confusing. But under the Symlinx var 6.0 path, a few of the things worth to note: there is a subfolder under there called ICC, which is used to store ICC profiles if you're trying to especially move those between servers. These paths tend to come up a lot when people are moving workflows from one server to new hardware, and they're trying to make sure they get all the old components. Maybe there's, like, for example, some ICC profiles that aren't explicitly called in PSCheck but are overloaded with a set param, and so don't get included in the normal workflow export. That's where those live. TWiST logging typically goes under this Symlinx var 6.0 log TWiST path. If I actually pull that up on my machine here. So these logs you've got, they're not all directly in that folder, but if I go to, for example, the R server log, this is all the, oh, can I make that any bigger? It'd be nice if I could make that bigger. I can't figure it out. I'll give up in about 10 seconds. That's fine. Hopefully it's enough you can at least see the gist of it, even if you can't read all the is there no preference? Oh, here we go. Let's make that a little bigger for you guys. That should be readable. Sorry about that. So for example, the repository log here, this is mainly showing you syncs to the server. So whenever anything is syncing, whether that's another TWiST server or whether that's your editor client via the gate, you get a log entry in there. So that's mainly just showing you sync attempts. If something goes wrong where maybe the secondary replica TWiST server is trying to hook up to the master and it can't make the connection, you'll tend to see errors with, like, the host won't start, and then you'll get an error in the repository server log relating to that. The workflow gate log, that's generally just showing you records of connections when people are trying to get into editor. And there is the Wiffle server log tends to hide under this other folder. This is a very useful log. It is not a very readable log. When we post this online, I'll put a link to, I did a webinar, I think about 2.5 years ago, where I did a complete breakdown of how everything in this log file works. This is when you are running files through TWiST and you've got your process log in editor. That process log is being pulled from this log file. So every event that happens in your TWiST server gets logged in here. You can see here that it's all kind of coded. There's the date, there is the name of the workflow, the server, the process log, the tool, and then you get the actual individual log lines for everything that's happening in here. But it's not very human readable. It can be useful if you have an issue, for example, because I think these take usually a week or two to rotate out before they get deleted. So if you have a file that goes through TWiST and you have an error today and you're trying to figure out what happened in that process log, sometimes you can grep through this, and if you know, like, the process ID, you can grep for that specific ID. And actually, I think I could probably show that real quick. That's actually not too crazy to show, so I do. So if I do, like, this is sent ES6 2309, so I could do a and I can see all the process log info for this one particular file. So if you know, like, if something happened to a file, went bad, but you didn't grab the log from editor in time, you can always look in here if you know the file name or something like that, and just do a grep like this to get that information a little longer. Like I said, I have a webinar we did in the past where I did a very heavy duty breakdown of this, and how to actually put this into your ES's Kibana instance so that it's very easily searchable, and you can keep some of those TWiST log entries long-term and make them easier to view. There are also some other log files above that in the var60 log folder. So you tend to have some logs from like actual, some of those are actual logs from, oh, that yelled at me. So those are actual logs from the litho tools that are doing like OPDF and ICC conversion. There's a lot of low-level stuff in there that usually a little too much detail, but it's always there if you want to poke at things. So going back to this slide, you've got 3 folders indexed for the repository, the workflow server, and the gate where configuration is stored. These are, I think they were in, here we go. So the repository is in here. You've got all your workflows and everything. What's strange with the repository is that it's not actually, I was talking to Jude earlier, the whole repository isn't stored under this whole repository directory. There's a few other directories it also pulls from, which are listed a little later down in this list. There's actually a file in here that I'll put it later. There's a slide later in here that'll show you the whole list of directories that are worth saving if you want to back up that whole repository. But most of it's in here in Symlinks var60 TWiST repository. There's also a lot in I think a Symlinks var60 TWiST setup. It's on the slide, which I'll go back to in a minute, but that's the other one. This one mainly has info on the users that might exist on the server, for example. It also has info on the actual workflows. The save parameters of, for example, like OPDF, if you have settings you've saved that you want to reuse, or saved param files, or rule sets or ink sets for trapping, those get stored in another directory. But this has that basic stuff in there. The TWiST gate directory has all the info on the gate. So wifflegate.conf shows you where that shows you the repository the server is looking at, the name of the server and the repository server, and how often it's going to pull that. Some of these config files, we've had issues in the past where maybe some customer had 3 different TWiST servers that were all independent of each other, and then they eventually decided they were going to link them together into a cluster. We've had cases in the past where some of these files didn't get updated, and there was some reference in here where it was trying to hit the wrong server, and that was why they couldn't get it to join a cluster. So that's why these files here can be useful to know. So there's that. There is the one that's interesting in here we'll get into later too is the DB location directory. This is when the workflow server, so that running thing from a few slides back that actually runs the workflows, that makes its own backup copy of the repository. It works from that, its own working copy of the repository, and it runs from that. It doesn't use the actual archival repository here, and the DB location is where the working copy of the repository gets stored. So you've got all your workflows, for example, under that, and I think it has some other state information about the cluster as well. These 2 files in here, which tend to cause a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. The same thing where sometimes if you have multiple servers are trying to join together in a cluster, this 6029 repository adder, that tells it the repository that this server should look at. So if this is like a replica in that setup, this should point to that master repository server rather than the local host. And then this is the name of this particular server. And again, we've instances, this is the name of it, and it's also its ID in the cluster. If you're clustering servers together, then typically they'll each have an ID. So this will be the first server, maybe there's TWiST2 would have the ID of 2. And sometimes if you join 2 servers that were previously independent into a cluster, they'll have a conflict there, and that can cause issues. So that's one thing to watch out for there. This also has, mentioning it's not everything in the repository lives in the repository, but this is kind of its to-do list of everything that it watches in here for the workflow server at least. So everything that it considers important to use. So then This folder we'll come back to later because there is a lot, this folder tends to cause a lot of grief because that working repository can get corrupted in certain situations. The two big ones that come up are sometimes if you stuff the hard drive or if you have like a power failure. Those are two cases where it's very common for this working repository, this DB location folder, to get corrupted. And there's a routine you can use to flush that out and get the cluster running again, because when that happens, TWiST won't start. So if you've been around for a while with TWiST, you probably had Jude tell you to nuke that folder a few times. So as far as other files in here, there's that one folder I mentioned, TWiST setup tools. This is where all your individual tool params are saved. So actually, maybe I should make this a little smaller so I don't keep jumping back and forth. Let me know if it's too small to read. But so setup, yep, TWiST tools. And so this is where, for example, if you have like any like ink sets or rules for traps or anything in here, those all get stored in there. If you got, for example, like your pre-flight profiles and stuff for PS check, that's where all these get stored. So this is kind of the second part of the repository. The two main parts are the SimLinksVar 6.0 TWiST repository, and then this SimLinksVar 6.0 setup TWiST tools. Now, a few other paths in here too are in this other Symlinks Dalim 6.0 folder, which again, these are kind of arbitrary splits, but there's a folder in here, Symlinks Dalim 6.0 script that holds a lot of scripts that Dalim uses for support and troubleshooting, not just for TWiST, but also for ES if you use that. There's looks like I forgot a sentence here, the DB export folder, which I won't go into today, but that's a folder where if you are doing a lot of set param from RE work in your workflow, so you are like overloading tool settings and you want to overload a specific parameter in, there's some button in, let's say, for example, this, it will do the ICC. Maybe there's a button in the ICC conversion tool that Dalim recently added and they forgot to add it in here. There's a file in DB export for that tool you can use to configure what shows in this dropdown and what's possible to overload in setparam from RE as a setting in another tool. So this next one too is Symlinks Dalim 6.0 litho bin. This is the low-level file manipulation tools that TWiST uses to do its work. So I do. Hope if I had a memory longer than 2 seconds. So if you go in here, there's all these different tools in here. And just to give an example, is like one of the big ones is PS Shoot is the one that's used to, that's what OPDF uses under the hood to generate PDFs. So I really can't type today. So like, for example, if you call that directly, you can see that it's a command line tool and you can call it directly from here as well and do whatever you want with that tool to modify files. So TWiST is just calling those litho tools under the hood. So that's an understanding of where that is. The second part of this is that there's also this workflow tools folder. And this is where the higher level workflow logic and UI for TWiST tools is stored. So that is, for example, if you go to my server here, there's some links to Dalim 6.0 workflow tools. Okay. So these actual tool files in here, so if you do, for example, outputs, and you look in here for OPDF, I could, yep. So the OPDF workflow, this is the actual tickle that when you use the OPDF tool in a workflow, this is the actual code that it runs in Tickle. And if you look in there, there's you can see that it's calling that PS Shoot tool that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So that's how that all works. So the more you know, but The last one here too is this default binding file, which I'll show in a little bit. You can use this to strip forbidden characters from file names during uploads so that they don't cause problems later on. So if you have a system that you know will freak out if there's an exclamation point in the file name that's downstream of TWiST, you can modify TWiST to automatically replace that at the time files are uploaded. So hopefully I'm not going too long here. We're getting close to the end. So Fred was betting whether or not I'd be under an hour today. Some of my webinars have been a little too long recently. So as far as configuring TWiST host, just to put some of this into practice, and this is getting more into the troubleshooting and administrating side of things now. So the configurator tool is used to set up individual TWiST servers or clusters. It is downloadable as a JNLP app. So if you go to your server and you go to port 8080, there's a download option for it. But that doesn't tend to work very well too much these days, just because a lot of that Java web start code won't run anymore for security reasons on newer things. I think I have that in here under, unless I actually got rid of that in TWiST 9. Oh, there it is. Yes, you can download, there's a little Java file. If you have the TWiST server itself, you can always just launch it directly on there and TWiST configurator 9x. I'll log into my server. It's probably hiding on me here somewhere. Here we go, I'll log in. So this is the tool when you first stage a TWiST server you can use to configure it. So to get back to a few of those settings we were talking about earlier, and here you can see that first off, this is the gate. You only use the configurator on the server that you're running, on a server that you're running a gate on. So this is my local gate is this server. This local server is supposed to point to this repository. If I had a cluster, this might point to a different master server than the one I'm currently on. You can see I've got our 6041 repository port and how often it polls. In addition to that, you've got a server set up here for the actual workflow servers. So this is the actual processing. In practice, you could have the gate and the workflow processing on different servers. Dalim used to do that in some cases for very heavy duty installations. It's not recommended anymore. So typically you have the repository on your master server. It's also a TWiST server. And you've got your gate on at least one of those servers, which I think Jude's recommendation these days is just to have one. So you can see we got the same thing with 6029 port. One of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is an issue we got recently on a ticket. When you set this up, you give it the host name, so like the host name or the IP of the server, so it knows which port to hit. But you can also give that server a nickname. So you can say like TWiST1 if you don't like the host name or it's too obscure. By default, it'll use the host name as a server. One case where we've run into a lot of problems with this is fully qualified host names. So for example, someone will configure sendts6@example.com and it'll automatically make that the server name. And the problem with this is that the way that TWiST log process log works, it uses a very specific regular expression in its log file, and that dot trips it up. And when you do that, the TWiST process log in editor starts looking really weird. So you can use a fully qualified host name here. Just if you do that, then just give it a different nickname or else you're gonna have a bad time. So that's just a heads up. One thing, it's a little beyond scope today, but you do have the ability in here, if you want to create your own users, you can create separate users for editor. I know the tradition seems to be everyone logs in with the same account, but you can create individual users in here. And you can also create templates for different permissions. So you can control who has access to what. You can control, for example, which users have access to which workflows. So who can see which workflows, who can edit which workflows if you want to lock some of that down. So not everyone in your business can see everything or modify everything. This is old school, so there's no way, unfortunately, to hook this up to LDAP. This is all done locally on the server, so it's all manual process there, unfortunately. But that's the way it is right now. So that's the basics of configuration there. And in addition to the fully qualified host name thing, this is again where I mentioned when you have these servers in here, if you're adding multiple servers, you go in here and click a new server, for example, and you put that in, but that's where you have the ID of 2. That's where those 6029 files I mentioned earlier can become a problem if you have an existing servers that you try to cluster together. Sometimes those will contain both be named number 1, have ID number 1, and that can cause issues. So as far as troubleshooting, I tried to break this down. I think we're getting towards the end here too, but as far as troubleshooting common problems that come up, the first steps, there's a few things to check overall if you're having major issues. One of the biggest is disk space. Usually home symlinks is where ES or where TWiST is installed by default. So if you have issues with that partition fills up, then TWiST will stop running work. And you can also have issues with the workflows. Will sometimes stop even running. They'll show as stopped in editor. And also with disk space, that DB location folder we were showing earlier can become corrupted. So that's one thing to check right off the bat. Also worth checking for drop tongue mounts. That can become an issue if you have if you have workflows that use a hot folder on a custom mount. That can cause issues. Make sure that all the services are running. So then that Symlink's common services that the I think in that case mainly the repository is running. If you're doing anything with like ES or WebLink, that Tomcat's running. The workflow server is one that you can't actually. You can check that the way to check with the workflow server is that usually will show as if that's stopped in editor, your host will show as down. And what's useful in this sort of case is to do like a tail on the logs. If you've done anything from the IT side here before. So I'll do my CD to Symlinks var 60 log TWiST, and I will do tail -f, start out log, and actually I could do the workflow server log in there too. So I get the 3 main log files here in my tail. And what this is going to do is watch those files, that anything that happens on the server will get logged. So for example, if let's say I shut down editor, you'll see that I have a workflow gate says that some user just disconnected, just to show you how these logs work in practice here. And if I log back in, we'll do a few other things here too. So you can see that a new user logged in. You see some repository hits because the gate's hitting the repository to see if I need to synchronize any workflows to my local client machine. If I stop the host, you'll see we get a whole bunch of logging for the repository. And if I restart the workflow, actually this is a good thing too, is if you ever stop a host, normally that'll say restart if you try and do it on a running server. This reset in here means that since it's down, I can tell it the workflow server when it comes up to pull a clean copy of the repository. So that can also be useful if you have any, you're having any issues, you can just tell it to do a clean pull from the repository. But yeah, if you had a issue with the workflow server service, you'd see the host down like that. You try and start it up, and sometimes it'll be in that like starting state. You can see it's doing some things to sync workflows. If you have any major issue, then that'll usually turn red again. You'll get the red circle again, but you might get some logging in here that tells you specifically why. And actually, we can go into that logging in the next page, but next things to check too are file ownership. So we're talking making sure those services are running. Check file ownership. On regular TWiST, most files in that Symlinks directory should be owned by the TWiST admin user, TWiST ADM user. We've had some cases in the past where there were issues with something got accidentally chmoded or shown to some group and TWiST couldn't read its own folders. We also had some issues in the past with, there's a few companies out there that like to use Centrify for all these users, and I think that's more a Jude question, but I think there are some cases where you need to do some special hoops and some special things to make sure that TWiST is happy with those Centrify users, so they can see them and have all the rights it needs to them. I think it's something to do with user IDs, but we can see here our host came up. One other thing is useful too if you're having just doing general troubleshooting at first and you're having just overall issues. There's this support script, and this works for both ES and TWiST. If you're using it on ES rather than TWiST, this will restart. I think this will restart Tomcat, so be careful running it during production hours if you're not having an issue in an ES system. Generally on TWiST, it's fine to run, but do that Symlinks Dalim 6.0 scripts. Script it is, yep. I had the wrong thing in there. And these two flags at the end, V means verbose, so give a lot of logging. The -F means if there's a problem with the server, fix it. And so this script will run, it'll check that it can hit certain services, it'll check that certain services it needs are running. It'll check whether it can access everything it needs to. It's common to get some errors on some of these installs. I don't know how bad my machine is right now, but just because you're seeing an error in here doesn't mean the system's necessarily in a bad state. I think some of these, in particular these services, Red Hat made a change to how the systemd scripts behave now, and that tends to trip this up. But generally this looks to see if the ports that it needs to communicate are open, and if it sees issues, it'll try to fix them. So especially like on new installs, this is very useful to do like a first step troubleshooting, just to see if it sees any problems and if it can try and fix them. So like in this case, it saw 3 things on my server didn't like, and it was able to correct them. So useful thing there. So as far as that was a general troubleshooting, next was the TWiST host or service won't start. We could check those service logs. I think that I jumped ahead of myself. Those are those tails I was just showing. One other one is that database location, that DB location corruption. If you have an issue with that folder where the host won't start and you're trying to troubleshoot, you can go to that folder and just delete it or move it out of the way, like rename it as like backup if you want to. And then you try a host reset in editor. So again, that the host will be down at that point. And then you delete that folder or rename it, and then try hitting reset and OK in here. And then it'll recreate that, it'll go back to the master repository and recreate that working directory. So that's one thing, especially if you're having issues after a full hard drive or after a hard power incident. One other issue in here I mentioned too is like sync issues between machines. So if you're trying to get this to start, it won't start, the DB location thing doesn't fix, and you're seeing all sorts of weird errors in rserver.log relating to like a sync, then it might be a case where if you have multiple TWiST servers in a cluster, they're having trouble talking to each other. In that case, open a ticket with us and we can look into the issue and talk with Dalim to get it resolved. So that gets a little involved for this particular webinar, but that's one thing to watch out for as a potential cause. Now, if a workflow won't start, you can check in addition to like the standard things we're talking about with the drives being stuffed, you can check like the editor, process, server, and workflow logs. So one thing, for example, is if TWiST procedures have been recently updated, you can check for typos. One thing that will break a workflow, for example, is if I go into, I don't even know what this workflow is. This is probably from something way back in the day. But like, let's say I'm editing a tickle procedure in here, and let's say I make a typo. So I forget a close brace here, and I'm doing my thing, and I save this workflow. And you'll notice that workflow shows as stopped. And if I try and restart the workflow, it'll stay up for a second. Usually it'll start, sometimes it'll stop again when I try and run files through. But that's one thing to watch out for. I think Jude said he's seen a few cases where that won't, that will cause like a whole cluster to go down. Because actually, I think if let's test my luck here. I bet if I drop a file into that, it's gonna error again, but we'll see. But if you hit the glasses here, you can see the logs for the server. So in this case, actually, the error was fairly clear that, yeah, this file, because this failed because it couldn't, the workflow, I started it again after that, but the workflow's still not running because there's a syntax error in that tickle. And if I look at the workflow status here, at least in this case, it's mercifully clear that it says, oh, that is hard to read, yeah, missing close brace and some tickle procedure. Sometimes those can be more obscure if there's some like more convoluted error in one of those tickle procedures. So that's one thing I tend to, whenever I'm editing tickle procedures in a workflow, I always tend to make a backup of that, like in a text editor locally, and then I watch the workflow status in here after I save it, because that's bitten me quite a few times. So you also have the same logs here for the servers as a whole, so you can click this, and sometimes if you have an error, even with like the sync errors I was talking about here, where like a replica server can't reach the master repository, then you'll get some errors in here relating to that. So one other common case we have too is workflows missing if the host is down. This is especially if you have multiple servers in your cluster, so you've got 2 or 3 servers. if a workflow is running on one server and that server stops, it won't show in the list. So if I stop my server here, you'll see all my workflows go away, which in this case here, that's pretty obvious. But if you have 2 or 3 servers and you've got 1 or 2 workflows that are running on a specific TWiST server, then it can be easy to miss that and wonder what happened to a specific workflow. This can also happen where too, if you have a workflow where it isn't deployed to a server. So if I save this now, this should disappear from my list. Yep, so that just disappeared, and I don't have that in here any longer because you control whether workflows live in one server. So you could say you want it deployed on all servers. You could have deployed on one server. If I had 2 servers, I could choose one of them. That comes into play too. Some people like downsizing or consolidating their TWiST servers. They might have a workflow running on one server. They might have 2 servers. They have a workflow running on one of them. They get rid of that server, and then the workflow just vanishes. If you ever run into that case, you can always get it back. It's always stored in your repository. So for example, if you go in here and hit browse, then you can, I think there was webinar file filter too. Yep, and you can open it through here, and then that'll bring it up in here. You do right-click properties and deploy it on either the one server if it needs to go to a specific server, or all servers if you want it to run on everything. And then that's what that can happen there. As far as runtime issues, one thing to watch out for that happens a lot too is hot folders and shared mounts. So if you had a workflow that was supposed to look at like, you've got like mount rshare, and you had that workflow running on 2 TWiST servers, they would both be watching that mount. And when a file came in, they would both try and grab it. And sometimes the one would get it in time. Sometimes maybe they both fight over it and they each get parts of it. And the file bombs out as soon as it gets into TWiST because it couldn't get a good handle on it. So that's one thing to watch out for there. One other one too, and this doesn't happen a lot anymore, but it does come up occasionally, is special characters in the file name. I think Linux has gotten more tolerant to this, but like if you've got like brackets or someone's just doing absolutely terrible file names, sometimes they can fail in TWiST, or maybe TWiST sees it fine, but another product you're delivering to downstream isn't as tolerant of that bad file name. Then you can go to that file I mentioned earlier, the default binding file. So this is in that Symlinks Dalim 6.0 IOWIFL etc binders RC. And this file is basically just a list of substitutions. So each of these pairs here and here, this first one, so for example, this is ampersand. This first pair says this is a forbidden character. And this second one here says what you want to replace it with. So this is Dalim's default file in here. So this is just saying to replace most of these with underscores or spaces. So that's what they did. There's a lot of Unicode characters in here. If memory serves, TWiST does not handle emoji well. So if you were hoping to add emoji to your file name, you are not in luck, unfortunately, but you can use this to do any file renaming that you need to upfront. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be related to unprintable characters. If there's certain phrases in a file name that, like there's like an old product code that you know needs to be nixed, you might be able to put that in here and have that do the substitution for you automatically in that case. So that's how that works. Now the last bit, and I think this is really the one more thing after that. So client-side issues. So if you're having issues not with the server, but you're having issues connecting to TWiST from your local PC. So there is a local file on your computer that lives, and it's in a different path from both Macs and PCs, but it's on Macs, it's usually under your home folder. I think I might have gotten that wrong. There's a hidden TWiST 8.0 folder. This is even for TWiST 9. They never updated it for TWiST 9. I think TWiST 7 and 7.5 use TWiST 7.0 instead, but there's a twe.log file. On Windows, it's under your home folder, app data, roaming, Dalim, twe.log. So if I go into that folder, you can see there's a file in there. And that's again useful for I don't know how to do a tail. I can't really get a tail to work in Windows subsystem for Linux, but I can see that folder here, and I'm going to cheat and do it in PowerShell. It has its own tail here. If you're doing this on a Mac, you could just do like the standard tail -f and then the file name. But you can. Let me. That's what I get for using auto completion there. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong folder. So let me retry that again. I got too lazy. So that would be TWE.log tail10. And so that monitors this file. So whenever I try to launch editor, for example, this will add logging in here. Actually make that a little smaller so I can see it. So if I do something with like a wrong username or something, you'll see its attempts to connect get logged in here. I'll do my good login. But you'll generally get any error messages that come up related to weird situations with editor. I think we've seen some things in there with like Java and stuff in the past. The one other client issue we've had, and there usually isn't too much that pops up in that log, but it is useful to know just in case. The one other issue that we've had crop up a few times, I was trying to reproduce it today. I'm not having any luck, I think, because I'm on a local server. I wonder if I can do it with our demo server, but I'm going to try real quick. If I can't get it, I can't get it. Yeah, so sometimes you'll see like a connect timed out like this, or you'll get, sometimes it'll just say null in there. We've had a lot of tickets about that over the last few years. The issue here is that when you try to connect up, this local editor client or the native editor client here works on both regular TWiST and eTwist. And before it can connect to a server, it needs to know whether the server it's trying to connect to is eTwist or regular twist. So when you put in a server name here, this sends out a whole bunch of requests to the server to try and identify what it is. And if like there's network slowness or something, sometimes it can take a little bit for that server to respond. So like you can see when I typed in that address, actually it already figured that one's a yes, but let me try my server again. Or I'll type in something gibberish here. You'll see you get that identifying in here where it tries to figure out what it is and it's trying to hit that server. Sometimes I think there's a glitch in here where it'll show you the login button before it identifies the server, and if you try to log in, you'll get that connection refused, or you'll get sometimes it'll just say the word null. So if that happens, then try it again and watch for that identifying thing. Wait until it tells you explicitly that it sees that it's TWiST or ES, because you can see here it's identifying, and then in a second that's going to, mine I actually have both on my server, both TWiST and eTwist, but once it identifies the server, then you can go ahead and log in. So one thing to watch out for there. I think this is the last point for the day, just up against Fred's bet of whether or not it'd be over under an hour today. But worst case scenario is if something goes horribly wrong and you need to rebuild from scratch because there was a power failure and more than just the DB location got corrupted or something went really bad with the server, then what you're going to want to do is flush the repository. Now that's the folder Symlinks var 6.0 TWiST repository that we were talking about earlier. If you have a multi-server cluster, as long as you leave that in place in the master, on like any of those replicas, secondary replica servers, you can nuke that on those replicas and it'll be fine. But if you nuke that on the master repository, then all the workflows are going to get removed. And if you're in that case where you're really hard down, then you might need to do that. In that case, then what I would do is rather than deleting it, just rename it to like repository.backup. In that case, I would also check to see if you have a good recent backup in your local TWiST local rep on your PC or Mac that you use to connect up, and actually make like a backup copy of that so that once you flush that, it's going to be a brand new server. It's not going to have any workflows on it. So you want to make a backup so that when you connect up, you don't hit sync and then lose that one remaining backup you do have. So make a backup there if you have it. Just rename the folder there rather than get rid of it if you're flushing this in the master. And then once the host starts, you need to manually re-import workflows and params. There's one thing actually, let me test real quick. Let me log in. I don't want to do a fake login now. What am I thinking?
Well, Alex's test not definitely, good time to point out, make sure you always have good backups of your servers, your client workstation, because that can save you. And we're always here for you. So as you're going through this, these tips sometimes are just maybe to help what, we're walking you through. So you're not clueless and just following us blindly. We're here for you if something catastrophic like this happens.
Yeah, this is just to Fred's point. This is just if you trying to demystify how TWiST works, that you understand how all these things connect together and the type of problems that tend to come up most commonly. So we can certainly help with things like this, just if you want the information so you know what the procedure is, and actually to Fred's point about backups, one other thing, at a previous job before I worked for Blanchard at a previous company, one thing we used to do that I really liked was that's the wrong folder there. This local repository that you have for your TWiST, that's nice because everyone who connects to your TWiST server has one of those. And that can be nice because it means you have a whole bunch of backups scattered throughout the company if something goes wrong with the workflows. If you make an edit you don't want to make, like I've had a few cases, I had a case a few years ago where I screwed up a workflow on a customer system I was working on, and I messaged Mike Moscato, was still here at the time before he retired, and was, Mike, do you have a copy of this workflow? And he looked at his machine, he hadn't synced up to editor that day, so for that customer. So he found the workflow file in here just under our root workflows, and he sent me the workflow file, and I undid the damage very quickly. But in a previous job, what we used to do too was we had on our Macs, we had Time Machine, and we had an external hard drive, and we set up Time Machine just on this local repository directory on our Macs. And so Time Machine would always take an incremental backup of that, kind of like a poor man's Git. And that way, if we made a mistake or we needed to undo something or there was a catastrophic incident, we could go back to pretty much any point in time and undo any changes that were made to a workflow or restore the get the backups of all those files after the fact. But yeah, the one thing I was going to test in here was, before I get sidetracked again, is I'm just going to delete.
You want me to take a couple of questions? What you're looking for, whatever you're looking for?
Oh no, I think I got it. Okay. I was going to test. It's a quick test, but one thing you can, I don't know if it works anymore. It's been hit or miss, but one thing you could try if you're trying to restore from backup, because at that point it's a manual process. You can try and get the repository, like the workflow files from that old repository. Generally, it's like the cluster states what gets corrupted. You can restore the workflow, try restoring the workflows and the params from that old one by manually copying them into the folders. The one thing you can try, I don't know if it'll, I remember this being hit or miss, is if you make the backup of the repository, you leave the old one in place, then when you connect up on the flush server, you get the editor thing in here that tells you there's a conflict. And so like in this case, I have a workflow that exists in my local repository that doesn't exist in the server. Typically the action for those, sometimes you'll get like discard is what you'll get if you flush the server. It'll tell you, do you want to delete everything that's on here? And in some cases you can say you want to upload. So this is different on my machine. I want to upload it and I want to make this what the repository has as its copy now. I've tried that in a few of these cases where we've had to reset hosts. I remember having issues where it wouldn't let me hit that option in that case when I flushed the repository, but it's one thing you can try. But if that doesn't work, then you would just need to take these files. These would go into your repository folder, that symlinks.var 6.0 TWiST repository. And then your param files would get stored under TWiST resources, setup. Those all get pushed into that symlinks.var 6.0 setup TWiST tools directory that we were looking at earlier. So you can copy those from your local PC, even if you're in that bad of a state where maybe even the server got nuked or someone did an RMRF, you can rebuild from that local repository that way. So, but as Fred mentioned, we can help out with that too at that point. That's not something we expect you to have to deal with on your own. So, and I was looking through as part of this, if you're trying to think of like what are the most essential areas to back up, we have an old Jude script he did years ago, like it was a complete TWiST uninstall script. And I was looking through that a while ago because before he does the uninstall of all Dalim software, he does a backup of the key directories. And in that script, these were all the things he listed as like the key directories that he wanted to keep. So that's like a slide to screenshot, I guess, or maybe I can put up like a knowledge base article, but those are if you're looking for like the most essential things to back up for TWiST in case you need to restore in the case of a disaster. Those are probably them.
We probably can send these slides out to everyone, all the attendees.
Yeah, I'll do an export. Mm-hmm. And when I post this, actually, when I post this on Zendesk, I'll put the PDF as an attachment there as well.
Sounds good.
So that there's a copy there as well for people to grab. And maybe at some point a knowledge base article, but that's pretty much the presentation. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so first question, I think I answered it directly. Please let me know if you didn't get it, but someone was interested in knowing what the webinar was that talked about the TWiST logs into Kibana. If I'm not mistaken, add it up a second, it's the January 2018 webinar. You can find all our webinars posted on our YouTube channel, so Blanchard Systems YouTube channel, and Dalim Tips and Tricks. We have a couple of playlists there. Dalim Tips and Tricks list all of them. The January 2018, I think, is the one. Was there another one now?
Yeah, there's that. The 2018 one's a little out of date at this point. The one I was referring to, there's a newer one. I think it's February or March of 2020. I see who asked the question, so I'll send out a link to them later with the webinar, but I think it's February 2020. If it's not February, then it's March. But and I have sample files for that as well in our Zendisk. So we actually have like a little setup you can use with Elasticsearch and Logstash, and I have the config. So you basically plug that in and point it at a TWiST server, and it'll recreate the whole process log in ES and store it in Elasticsearch and Kibana indefinitely. So we do have a few customers actually using that in production now to keep that historical logging data. But yeah, that webinar shows you, it has all the files you need to set it up, and the webinar is basically an hour and a half of me walking through every obscure setting in that process.
Again, if you're interested in any of our older webinars, they're all on our YouTube channel, so you can look for them there. Okay, I think you may have answered this. Where would I find the editor logs on my local machine? I think you just covered that, didn't you?
Yep, that would be, it's different on PC versus Mac, but those are in a Mac, it's in, I think I might have gotten this initial path wrong, but it's your home folder. There's a hidden folder, TWiST 8.0. That is 8.0 even for TWiST 9. For TWiST 7 and earlier, I think it's the actual correct version number, and then TWE.log. For Windows, it's your home directory, app data roaming, Dalim, and then TWE.log again for TWiST editor log.
Great. All right. If I wanted a custom folder of files pushed to all TWiST servers in my cluster, can I do that?
Yeah, I think this is
custom folder of files. I'm not sure, we may have to go back to that unless somebody else understands that question that's on here.
I think what they want is a folder that would be common to the master, but we replicate out to all these slaves in the cluster. And you can do that. You can create your own custom folder within the repository, like under the tools. You know, you can go use Symlinks, setup, TWiST tools. If you make a custom directory in there and put something in there, that would be copied to all the slave machines.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess this here, you can cheat even if they're technically not tools. You can copy whatever you want. So.
Right. You may have to trigger an event to cause the repository to replicate, like stopping and starting the host or whatever, but that folder will get created.
Yep. So that's like if you have like templates you want to use for merge XP or imposition or something, you could do that way, I guess.
Can the repository and gate logs be more verbose?
Yep, there is a logging file. Where does that live? So Symlinks var 6.0.
It's in the
yeah, that's in the
6.0 repository directory. Yeah.
I typo horribly.
6.0 TWiST.
There we go. So yeah, the log4j. By the way, too, if you're worried about the log4j issues from last winter, the current patches of TWiST do use a patched version of log4j that doesn't have the vulnerabilities, the log4shell vulnerabilities, and I think longer term, Dalim's getting away from log4j too. But I guess is it this one where you can change that's where you can change rolling, and yeah, I guess this one's debug, and you can change that to info if you wanted more detail on the logs. So.
And then I think this is the last question is, what is the future of TWiST? Because I guess they've heard different rumors at different worldwide technology meetings. You can say the best thing to do, I'll talk about it a little bit, but best thing to do is make sure you either attend in person or catch it virtually, the worldwide technology meeting, which would be December 5th through 9th this year. It is a hybrid event, so it'll be available online. I'll be going to Strasbourg to attend it personally, finally, after a few years. So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, as you know, Dalim is working towards maybe merging eTwist and TWiST. what that's going to look like, we don't know yet. Hopefully we've learned a little bit more this year. There's also, we still believe TWiST will be its own product, whether it's under the umbrella of ES as a tool of ES completely, or Link as the other product future, or part of what currently is Dalim Drive, which is kind of the tools broken out into their own JDF devices. We'll see. We're looking forward to learning a little bit more of the future plans. But in the near future, next couple of years, nothing to worry about. TWiST is a standalone product, just as you have it. Will exist and will be kept up, patched up, kept up with the latest PDF technologies and everything. So nothing to worry about there as far as any big changes in the next couple of years. And I think that's it. Thanks, Alex. You didn't hit the 1 hour and 20-minute mark, but we hit 1:10. But thanks everybody for attending. In the next week or so, you'll get the link to the video. We'll also send out, Alex will do something where you have the availability to get to the slides so you can see the paths and have them available. So thanks a lot, everybody. Y'all have a great day.